for these things called projects. We're more designed to make sure that we wake up in the morning, right? So essentially, a project is kind of our brain's side gig when the primary focus of the brain is to survive. So when we are looking at project management and we're looking at traditional project methods, there's really an assumption in traditional project management that everything can be done logically and rationally. But yet we recognize that humans actually are optimized for survival. And in reality, we diverge away from this concept of, or the idea of being logical and rational all of the time. I recently read a study out of Brazil where they were looking at how people interpret threat. And they were evaluating what happens through fMRIs, which are functional MRI machines. And they were looking at how do we perceive a threat when it comes towards us, and how do we perceive a threat when it comes away from us or goes away from us. When a threat is coming towards us, there's actually 60 regions of the brain that are activated at one time. So the brain works in kind of these neural networks, not really just these highlighting of one spot at a time concepts that we once thought. It's really more of a gridded map where multiple sections are trying to assess things all at the same time. It also turns out that 52 of these regions are attempting to predict what's going to happen. So while 60 regions are actually activated, only 8 of them are trying to do some level of prediction. Now, when we take it and we look at a threat moving away from us, it kind of moves us into this ambiguous place, right? Because we can't necessarily get all of the feedback that we need to truly assess the situation. And when a threat is moving away from us, there's only 43 regions of the brain that are activated, but then 38 regions are predicting. So we're using less essentially of our brain power, or we're having less activation in the brain when a threat is moving away from us. So really and honestly, the ability to assess something as far as whether it's a threat coming towards us or a threat moving away from us becomes ambiguous. And I bring that up because in projects, we don't typically have a lot of threats coming towards us. They would be more in this kind of sidelined, if it's an obstacle, could it be a threat? And is it actually coming towards us, or is it moving away from us? Keep this in mind as Josh and I are presenting, because we may reference back to this study a couple of different times. So ultimately, what does it mean for humans to be optimized for survival and this whole traditional project management piece? In project management, the methods were designed on the assumption that technical skills are void of any human impact. That really and honestly, all you had to do was to teach these technical skills over and over and over, and you would be free and clear, right? But what we have found is the reality is humans impact the technical processes, the inputs, the outputs, and throughout the entire life cycle. And we've also found that behavioral aspects have a larger impact than the technical aspects. And they're actually, well, my slide's not changing, sorry. Got a technical issue here. We're actually having 70% of our projects are impacted by behavior, and only 30% are impacted by technical skills. Next slide.
So I love this slide, by the way, because if we're comparing the brain to a computer, there's kind of several attributes that are similar between a brain and a computer. They both have inputs, memory, processing, and outputs. And each one of those in a computer, that's more logical, rational, straightforward, if-then scenarios. And just like Jodi was explaining, the brain is a little bit different. And so especially in that memory and processing area, the logical and rational assumptions get changed by these different cognitive things that are going on in our brain. And so what that does is that ultimately changes the outputs and potentially changes or reduces the reliability of the outputs from the brain. So we have to start in order to improve that, we have to recognize how those outputs are changed so that we can redesign our processes around those. So just to kind of give you a quick idea, or, because when we talk about the word behavior or neuroscience or psychology, sometimes we kind of get this kind of these assumptions that, well, it's some soft skills, maybe it's leadership, it's communication, but really it's more than that. The whole brain is really, a lot of electrical impulses and chemicals, and these things are actually biological and physical. They're not just kind of soft, and we're not really guessing so much at them as there is a hard science behind a lot of it. And so I just wanted to give you kind of a couple of examples. This is your brain on time pressure. You'll notice that the urgent task is on the left-hand side. You can see the brain's all lit up versus a more evaluative task on the right-hand side. And this is just to kind of give you a visual representation of the physical things that are going on in your brain. So time pressure is very relevant because of the time constraint, right? So our discipline is defined by time pressure. And then we have optimism in the brain. Jodi?
So one of the things that we've actually found out with the amygdala is that it's more responsible for positivity in the respect that it is responsible for your survivorship, right? So even when we are negative, so say we are actually in a situation where there is kind of a high threat, or there is something going on that we're like, no, I don't think that it's going to work out positively. That is actually our brain still being positive when we're negative. So to speak, you would look at it as future positive. So in this box, we have this element that says future positive. Your amygdala is the one that's saying, in the future, we know we're going to survive if we do X, but we're future negative if we can't accomplish that. And so when we're looking at the positive versus the negative, it's funny how even in those negative elements, there's still a positive kind of survivorship piece going on for the brain.
Right. And then this is your brain on risk. So those are just a few examples of the physical things that are going on in your brain. It's more than just soft skills. It's more than just emotions or those type of deals. There's actually measurable cognitive elements going on in the brain that change the outputs of information processing. So with that, what we look at in behavioral project management is kind of redesigning project management around the brain and around the way those processes work in the brain. And so this is just kind of a quick reminder based or recovering what we presented a couple years ago, just kind of introducing behavioral project management a couple years ago. This is kind of the four major modalities where we can see improvements would be made across project management. Redesigning the processes, which means, like, if you look at PMBOK processes, for example, you would redesign those based on the science around the brain. Redesigning the way you measure things in the project based on cognition. Redesigning things such as interfaces like softwares, for example. And then where we might have those frames of reference that, something to do with behavioral science is only updating our skills, but skills is only, the way we see it, about 25% of changing project management around the brain. So what does the redesign part look like? So here's just a couple examples, and then we're going to go into this exact process. But there is a study out there that identified that if you identify obstacles prior to estimating resources or estimating duration, optimism bias goes down and realism in the estimate goes up. Now, this has to happen by identifying the obstacles prior to making the estimate, so that's very important. But this was a behavioral science study directly in project management that took and measured and said, okay, how do we insert more realism into the process? And what they found is by asking to identify obstacles prior to that, the optimism bias was reduced. So this is just one example of a scientific study in behavioral science in project management, where you would redesign your project management processes around the behavioral science. So if we were to look at it from a PMBOK standpoint, this might be what it would look like. Just using as a PMBOK as an example, you would plug in this study that identified obstacles and put it right between the PMBOK activities here. And then you would have essentially a new behavior-informed evidence-based process that you could add that was designed based on cognitive science. And then this is just taking that obstacle identification activity or obstacle identification process and looking at it, how it would go across the 4 modalities of behavioral project management. So using that example, what we've developed is, and this is for planning specifically, is a series of processes that cover the planning phase, and it would actually be anything to do with prediction. So we call them project prediction processes. So whether it's planning, forecasting, anything looking forward where you're developing activities. So this specific sequence is designed based on what we know in the behavioral science, considering time pressure, cognitive load, the anchoring effect, which is a very common thinking error, for example. So what we're going to do is focus on this one process here, which we call identify obstacles, which I also identified a couple slides ago that came out of that behavioral science study. So we're going to focus on this one in this presentation because it's very easy to implement, yet it has a very big impact on your estimating process. So we will go now into the obstacles piece of the presentation, and which we'll go to Jodi.
So for those of us who are trained in Agile, we know that part of our Agile process is to kind of look at obstacles already and to look at impediments or impediments, depending upon how you want to pronounce it. But essentially, we're also looking for what needs to be done before we can do what we need to do. So on a project, one of our obstacles can be, do we have everything done in order to start the next phase or in order to start the next iteration? In traditional project management, it's, do we have everything that needs to be done in order for this project to move forward, in order to do the planning, in order to make the predictions of how our estimations are going to be accurate or how we are going to implement and execute the project. Essentially, this is one of those places where we start. Now, there is an overlap here where some of the obstacle identification is already embedded into Agile. However, Josh and I are going to go deeper into additional obstacles that people often overlook. And so we'll add more even for the Agile folks to be able to be like, oh, I never thought of that as an obstacle, or this may also be an additional obstacle.
So I get a lot of questions. So I decided to address this one early, right up front, because I always get this question. It's actually a really good question. Well, what about risk? We're already doing risk identification, right? Why would we add obstacles to that? Well, first, the studies found that you get more reliable estimates when you identify obstacles prior to estimating the duration or the resources. But there's a difference too, because risk, as you know, may or may not occur, while obstacles will occur. And so there's a big difference here in the cognitive processing, because if I bring in the word risk and the things that may go wrong, my brain kind of goes into this, things could go wrong. And then things like cognitive dissonance, which is essentially mental discomfort associated with new information may come in. I may get uncomfortable with the idea of something bad happening. And then my brain can go to the optimistic side and say, well, it probably won't occur. So I'm going to be optimistic about this. And I'll say the probability is low, or I'll just strike it from the risk register, right? That's just one example. So that's risk. It may or may not occur. So it puts the brain into a kind of a different way of looking at things. But if I ask you what obstacles are in the way, obstacles will occur. And that is processed a little bit differently. And so why obstacles versus risk? Risk may or may not occur. Obstacles will occur. And so if we look at obstacles, it's kind of like navigating an obstacle course, right? You must navigate the obstacles to get to the other side. So if you're looking across the obstacle course, it's, I've got to get over those obstacles in order to get to the end. Whereas risk is a little bit different. Risk is kind of like the Band-Aid you might need if you slip on the obstacle and fall and scrape your knee, right? So obstacles and risk are significantly different from not only the perspective of the brain, but also changing how the estimates come out in the end in terms of changing the reliability of the estimate. And this is Jodi. Oh, this is me. Sorry, Jodi. So to me, it's not just like a cool little trick that, well, just identify the obstacles, but it actually changes the outcome of the project. Because if we identify what can go wrong, then we get a chance to fix it, right? And when we do that, we get a chance to accelerate the work, which reduces the cost and hopefully ends us completing ahead of schedule. And so the difference is, if you're identifying obstacles, you get a chance to mitigate them. And you're also increasing the reliability of the estimate. But this gets you potential project acceleration, because when we identify something, we can fix it versus avoiding it and then running into it. And as many of us know in project management, that ends up in variance analysis and behind schedule and trying to explain what happened to the client, et cetera. So, and this part is Jodi, my apologies.
And when we're looking, like, as a Scrum Master, so I'm a Scrum Master. As a Scrum Master, I also want to be sure that I am essentially clearing as many obstacles as I potentially can. So either kind of running ahead of the team and clearing obstacles with people, making sure that things can flow through the pipeline as quickly and efficiently as possible. But I have to identify those obstacles. My team has to identify those obstacles. And we have to all be talking about those openly throughout the sprint or our iteration. Really, in the traditional project management, we're talking about bringing them into the conversation as well. So if our brain stops us from finding what's going wrong, so essentially if we don't have that team set up, or if we don't have this obstacle process going, then that decelerates the work. We're moving much slower, kind of like walking through quicksand versus being able to, hop on a bicycle and really pump out 20 miles an hour as we're going down the road. It also increased the cost. So anytime the work takes longer, the cost goes up exponentially. And we all have lived this, right? On every project, we have seen it, where it's the whole hurry up and wait, right? And the waiting costs money. And then it's the hurry up again and wait because we've run into another obstacle. That push pull on a project also has it wears on the motivation and the engagement of individuals working the project as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a quick little story. So I did a small informal study of 7 samples on a very large mega project in DOE. And what we found is that all the project delays that were occurring, 65% of those were predictable, which means in many cases they were avoidable. So for example, project manager may have said, okay, well, we're showing up to this area of the site to work this part today. And then we show up and a crew of 8 gets there and they can't because there's another crew in the same location. But it turns out that the other crew was on the schedule for 6 months. So in this case, it was a predictable occurrence. It was a predictable obstacle. Well, what happens when you have 8 guys who have to go from that area and then be redeployed to another project if they get redeployed that day? Let's just assume they, don't get redeployed to another project for another 4 hours. Well, you got 4 hours and times 8 guys times $50 an hour. So what happens is you end up with waste and on top of the scheduled delay, you have waste, all from the failure to identify the obstacle that was predictable. So there's a real cost associated, I think, with bad prediction. So now we're going to switch gears just a little bit into more cognitive and behavioral obstacles.
So we're going to start looking at 9 overlooked obstacles in projects. They're kind of like these silent obstacles. We oftentimes can see if there's an obstacle in a schedule, but we can't always see some of the processes that happen on that cognitive level or the behavioral processes that also result in obstacles in the project.
So the first one is my favorite because it was also part of my study toward a theory of behavioral project management. And what we all know as project management practitioners is that project management is defined by a time constraint, right? It is a temporary endeavor to deliver a product or service. It has a beginning and an end. And that end, that time constraint, is what separates us from operations. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have project management. Here's the key. Time pressure does all kinds of crazy things to your brain. As I showed you that first fMRI scan that showed time pressure on the brain, your brain is making physical changes based on that time pressure. So there's the area kind of lower in your brain known as the striatum. And what it does is it acts as a switch. And so when you're under time pressure, different from a computer, which cannot be really put under a time pressure that I've been able to find yet, as the time pressure gets put on, the striatum essentially shuts off your inhibition system or slows it down. And what that does is it causes premature decisions. And what that ends up resulting in is a higher reliance on heuristics, which is kind of defaulted to your brain's old habits. It reduces creativity. It can increase risk taking when losses are involved. So it has all kinds of things. It causes you to rely on the automatic system in your brain versus the more evaluative system. And so time pressure, which is the very defining aspect of project management, is essentially reducing, in many cases, the decision making in the projects that we're working on as compared to operations. So that is a really big one.
And then we have cognitive dissonance. And I'm sure many of us have seen this piece where, say, you are walking up to a manager and you have a piece of information and the manager just really can't believe or can't stop long enough to say, okay, hey, wait a minute, this actually might be valuable. What happens is that a manager will kind of have this manager or teammate will have this pre-selected like roadmap in their mind of how something's going to work and how they're going to move the project forward. Then when you bring them additional information that says, we might need to pause, we might need to turn left, we might need to turn right, we might need to allocate different resources. Sometimes they cannot stop and say, okay, I need to take this new information in because it's so inconsistent with what they already believe the path forward needs to be. And so that cognitive dissonance actually becomes an obstacle because they're not able to take in the new information and to assimilate it because it doesn't go with kind of the grain of the direction that they're going. Then there's psychological inertia. So we all know like things in motion tend to stay in motion. We do that as humans as well. So say we have, a task that we're doing at work. It's really common when we have those computer updates, right? So we're sitting there working on our computer and we're like, wait, what just happened? And then they did an update and it changed your search bar, like on the last iPhone update where it changed your search bar from the top to the bottom. That is an element of psychological inertia where you're like, wait, no, I didn't want this to change. I want this to keep going. Well, when we're looking at psychological inertia from a project perspective, there may be a spot where we need to veer to the left, but yet we're so accustomed to doing something, if, say, specifically in our planning or in our estimating, we're so accustomed to doing something in a routine way that we can't take in new information again, right? Or because somebody tries to put in a new kind of procedure or a new like guidance document or a new step, we're so accustomed to moving in that one direction that coming off of it creates this inertia effect, and we just kind of bypass it, kind of like driving down the highway and forgetting to get off at the exit that you need to go at. You need to get off at.
Yes. The next one, we title it defaults because this is a cognitive a term in cognitive science known as heuristics, and essentially what it does is it causes us to default to what the brain already knows or has seen. It's an automatic response. By the way, these defaults increase under time pressure. So when time pressure comes in, the brain then automatically says, I'm going to the fastest thing that I know right now. It's back to what our brain has already seen, those things that are most vivid in our memory, etc. So one example of heuristic is, or a mental rule of thumb, is your predictive text in Google. So if you were to go to Google right now, if you start typing in project, it'll start giving you the next word suggestion, just like you see here on the screen. So it might say, you type in the project, it says management, behind schedule, project risk, right? And the more words you start typing in, the more the computer starts to guess what you're about to say. So it's filling in the information, whether or not the information is what you want. So heuristics are doing the same thing. They default to a reference in your brain automatically without you consciously knowing it or pulling it up. So if I start doing something on my project, I start thinking about risk, your brain's going to default to the things that are most vivid in your memory, most colorful, or the things that have happened so many times you can't forget them. So it's just like predictive text, and it just starts taking guesses. Now, if you take those guesses, just like here it says looking for, well, there's a job, a room to rent, a friend, and your brain just automatically feeds you one of those, and you're unconsciously aware that it is, you might rely on that information as something you're going to make a decision with. And so those defaults are very important for decision making.
To add to that one,
yes.
Remember the study that I was telling you about in the beginning? On the threats towards an individual, the responses are very consistent. The brain lights up in a very consistent way, and it predicts consistently from one participant to the next. When the threat is away, so essentially when it's ambiguous, like what we would find on a project, then our responses become inconsistent, and they become inconsistent along the same lines as the defaults or the heuristics, because we start moving into, well, the last time that I saw X happen, then Y was the result, which is different based on individuals. So this is where we start seeing some of those inconsistent responses to ambiguity and less of a universal understanding of the same obstacles. Kind of
Right.
like one person can see something as an obstacle and another person is like, I never even thought that.
Yeah.
This is the point where that obstacle starts happening, and those differing viewpoints and differing perceptions of obstacles start occurring.
I always, it may be kind of a crazy example, but I always use this with my students. It's like looking down the hallway. If you're looking down the end of a very long hallway, and at the very end of it, very far away, you see this kind of rectangle object. Well, you're in a hallway, you're going to assume it's a door. Your brain doesn't know for sure because you're not standing right next to it. But because you see the rectangle object and you've seen so many at the end of hallways that are doors, your brain automatically assumes it's a door. And that's just automatic referencing system.
So as it relates to obstacles in the project, people will make assumptions, right? So you will start seeing people make assumptions that, well, no, but this wasn't really a problem before. And other people are like, really? Because I think that it delayed us by 5 days last time. And you have people running into these defaults of, well, let's explain it away, or let's not worry about it now, or let's not sweat the small stuff. I mean, you have all kinds of kind of excuse making that and start showing up, and those tend to be defaults that people are running on.
Right.
Psychological safety. So going back to dissonance and to psychological safety, as someone who works with organizations and works on a lot of those people processes, I will get information and I will get repeated information that organizations have issues around creating safety, around creating trust, and around creating a place of security for people to communicate. So we know that in order for people to bring up a concern, they have to feel safe enough to express it, right? And then there's the element of not only can they express it, but is somebody actually going to do something with that concern? Is it going to be heard as a concern? And will there be appropriate action taken towards it? Now, appropriate action taken towards it can simply mean that it's acknowledged and someone says, look, I hear you, I hear this concern. However, this isn't the priority today, but let's go ahead and keep it on the radar. Or that just isn't in the budget right now. Let's review it in 6 months or a year. With psychological safety, you have to create an environment that allows people to speak up. Sometimes we get, especially in some of the projects that Josh and I work on, there's a lot of terminology around the safety culture. Well, okay, yes, having a safety culture is important, but do you have the foundational level of psychological safety in place for people to speak up and to say, this is a concern, or that people aren't identifying a specific obstacle that could become a concern because they don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. They don't feel like they will be heard. They don't feel like their information is accepted or considered or even validated as a concern or as a contribution, right? Sometimes it isn't even about concerns. It's just about contribution. I'm trying to add to the conversation. I'm trying to add to the backlog. I have information of, hey, you know, this might actually not work the way that you think it's going to work because we need to add code here before we can have the code come out down here. So also on projects, that piece of, if I can't come to you and say, you know, I have concerns about how we're doing recruiting on this project, and we don't seem to be getting people who are really coming to us with diverse thought, right? We don't have a lot of perspective. We seem to always be getting, you know, the manager's best friend from 3 projects ago that's now moving across country. we have those pieces going, those impact psychological safety, our ability to have not brutal conversations, but really some of those humble inquiry techniques where we can ask questions. There are organizations that it's not okay for you to even ask. Asking is perceived as a threat. There are also organizations where, like, even having a crucial conversation or even trying to talk about something of some level of discomfort. And the level of discomfort can also seem pretty odd, right? Where you're just kind of like, I don't think that this should be as sensitive as what they're taking it as. That is also an indicator that psychological safety is an obstacle. If you have people who are not speaking up, if you have people that you constantly have to kind of bring in on the sideline and be like, hey, I know that you have valuable things to say here, but you almost have to really pull it out of them. That's telling you that the psychological safety of that group or that area is impacted. And so it's actually becoming an obstacle. Oh, decision fatigue. So, how many of you at the end of the day don't even want to decide what you're going to eat for dinner? I mean, really and honestly, we could probably take a poll right now, and I would assume that we would have a good percentage of people who are like, I don't want to decide. Over the course of a day, over the course of a week, over the course of a month, we have lots of decisions that we have to make, right? And so what happens is we get decision fatigue. Our ability to add another decision into the pile of already existing decisions becomes impacted. And so we're not looking at them with fresh eyes, right? We're making decisions when we're in a hurry, when we're pressured, when we don't have all the information, but we don't feel like we have the time to get all of the information, when we're in situations where we're under a time crunch or it's the last minute of the day and everybody's contacting you at 5:05 and you're trying to get out before 5:30. Those are those pieces where decision fatigue really has this compounding effect. Now, as a manager or as a team member, some of that's also about managing your own energy, right? So when you start the day, are you better off at doing decisions, especially big decisions early in the morning? Are you the kind of person where as it gets closer to lunch, you probably need to not make quick decisions, and then after lunch, look at some important decisions again? Some of the way that our projects are set up, some of the way that our teams are set up, they're not necessarily conducive to managing decision fatigue. We're constantly being brought with decisions and expected to decide on the spot, when truly we need to say, you know what, I don't have enough information here. I need to have more detail. Could you get me, the report or the analysis, or could we look at last month's estimations and see where we were? Before you make that decision is really important, because a poor decision becomes an obstacle. I worked with a manager one time who didn't really believe me that, kind of time is money, and that if you make a poor decision, it has a financial cost. It was truly interesting that he made a poor decision that then cost about 10 extra hours of my contracted work, which made his bill go up. But he could not see how his decisions impacted the delivery of the project, impacted the ability to complete the project, and how he was actually creating more obstacles for the project. So decision fatigue can impact a lot of things, but it can also, in those poor decision-making times, create more obstacles rather than less. Back to you, Josh.
Yeah, so well, I guess we're starting to run a little bit low on time. All right, so time pressure. What's this doing to my brain? Anyway, cognitive load. So cognitive load is, you can kind of think of this like the RAM in your computer, the random access memory. As the more programs you open up, And the more, let's say you have a photography editing program over here and a PowerPoint and Excel and all kinds of programs running in the background, like heuristics, right? The cognitive load is like the RAM on the computer. The more programs you have open, the more that computer starts getting bogged down and starts running slower. And in the case of the brain, your outputs start becoming less reliable. So that's kind of a really simple one to explain, but it has a very big impact in that maybe not all the information starts to get through. And when your information reliability starts to go down, your project management decisions start to go down.
And the big kicker for this one that we see is also that element of, did you even take a lunch? Because if you're working through lunch, you're not giving your brain the access to any kind of break that would give it a release valve, right, off of that cognitive load.
Yeah. And cognitive load and decision fatigue often are only cured by sleep.
Or breaks. Sometimes meditation.
Yeah.
People will use meditation. They'll kind of do those, like, you can't sometimes do them at work, the micro naps, but at least you can power your brain down. That's the point, right? Give it a break. Allow it some time to listen to music, or just kind of get quiet for a little bit. Social pressure. All right. So in social pressure, what we're looking at is kind of more of that group dynamic, right? So social pressure can become an obstacle back kind of in conjunction with that psychological safety. If we are trying to work with other people and we don't want to kind of upset them, if we are in a situation where we're constantly saying yes when we should be saying no occasionally, social pressure also comes into play when we are trying to look positively to other people, or when we are trying to gain favor. So sometimes if we're trying to get onto another job track, we may actually succumb to some social pressure. We may actually kind of bandwagon, what we call get on the bandwagon with other people, and not stop or not recognize or not vocalize that there is an actual obstacle, because the risk then becomes to us socially. So there can be fear of retaliation. There can be fear of any kind of ostracizing, might be too strong of a word, but kind of not being a part of the in-group, getting into that out-group status, or losing social status by speaking up. We also have social pressure that happens where it's called social loafing, when you have one person who doesn't quite do the level of work that they need to on the team, and they put a lot of pressure on other people by not doing their share or what they have agreed to. So that adds to the social pressure. Social pressure is truly a big umbrella. And it is an obstacle when you are trying to, say, do something new in a team and you've got a lot of resistance from the majority of the group. That creates a level of social pressure. Overall, it can be a large obstacle, and it's one that you really have to work through in order to keep the team and the group functioning cohesively. But yet the cohesion needs to be safe enough and have the malleability to have some levels of discord, right? Or questioning or curiosity to them.
Yeah, also social pressure. What is concerning about social pressure is it's one of the greatest motivators of human behavior, whether negative behavior or positive behavior. But what's concerning is that it changes the information output, right? So one example is what they call strategic misrepresentation in planning, where the social pressure to conform based on an incentive, for example, causes us to optimistically, in most cases, or pessimistically plan a project in order to meet some kind of incentive, or the social pressure to conform to a schedule milestone, for example. So social pressure is one of the key drivers in strategic misrepresentation, which often ends up in a lot of projects being planned optimistically.
We also see it with ethical issues too. So there can become ethical issues with strategic misrepresentation and the social pressure from it in order to conform and not speak up if there's an ethical issue. Our next one, noise. You would think that it's like people playing with their iPods or running their music on their computer loudly. The thing is with noise is that in every project, there is relevant information and there is irrelevant information. I've done a lot of work specifically in leadership development in helping people understand and know when to look at a detail and when to move away from a detail. When we are impacted by noise, we get stuck on a detail that isn't relevant to the situation. So we have a hard time coming away from that element and recognizing how it either doesn't impact a project or how we need to pull back and see the project from a bigger standpoint, or that kind of, everybody likes to use the 10,000 foot view, but there's also that 5,000 foot view and the 10-foot view. And you really have to be able to move through each of those sections. We also know that with noise, what we're trying to do is we're trying to match the right scenario and the right functions to the right situation. If we're paying attention to noise or something that's irrelevant, then we're not applying the right scenario to the right situation.
Jodi, you want to take this one? We'll just share it. How's that?
We'll share. So time pressure leads to misinformation when we're looking at overlooked obstacles. Missing information when it comes to time pressure is how that becomes an obstacle on the project.
Yeah, and I know Jodi covered dissonance before, but I love the subject of cognitive dissonance because that's that mental discomfort. We see something, we're like, no, too much for me. And that causes avoidance of information. So if you're looking at all these, we also call them cognitive moderators in neuroplan. You can kind of think of them as filters through the brain. Information comes into the brain, it gets filtered through all these 9 different moderators, and it changes the output potentially into inaccurate and unreliable data. And so each one of these is time pressure may cause us to miss information. Cognitive dissonance may cause us to avoid information. Psychological inertia can cause us to bypass information.
Like not getting off at the right exit, that costs you time.
Right.
And gas money, which is getting expensive right now.
Yes.
Back to defaults. The thing about defaults is that you're doing shortcuts to the wrong information, right? And so it also has that piece. A default also has the piece where you really want to match the scenario. So you want to use the right default at the right time. Going back to the computer analogy, I can't tell you how many times I have thought that I was copying something and I'm going to paste it, and I have pasted twice and not copied anything. So that's using the wrong default for the scenario. I need to copy first and then paste. Really matching those defaults, knowing I use a lot of work with strengths. And when we're looking at strengths, you really want to use the right strength in the right scenario. If I'm talking about working in a group and I'm talking about honesty, yes, honesty is an important strength, but you want to keep it moderated and not be overusing honesty, and also use other strengths like equitability, fairness, those pieces where you're also taking in information from the group and not just outputting information to the group. That's another element that really helps with those using the right default in the right scenario. And it ties back into the psychological safety and really making sure that we aren't creating any situation where there's a fear of providing information, because the fear of providing information adds a lot to risk. It adds a lot to obstacles. It adds a lot to cost. And in some cases, it can be detrimental, not only psychologically to people, but in the physical safety of people, depending upon your project.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossovers between safety and planning and prediction and risk, by the way, and from the behavioral perspective. Then cognitive load. so once we're talking about cognitive load, remember it's like the RAM in your computer. And so once you start slowing that down because you have too much going on, that starts not processing enough information, it starts under processing information. And then the social pressure, like we were talking about with strategic misrepresentation, that has the ability to change the information. So if you knew that something was going to take 10 days, but you said it was going to take 5 days because you were incentivized to make it look optimistic to win the bid, for example, you change the information from accurate to inaccurate. But sometimes this is not even intentional. Sometimes it's just subconsciously going on in the background because the social pressure, we're so used to the social pressure.
The other piece that happens with social pressure are things like we get statements about, take one for the team and just work with us. Are you going to be a team player on this one? That usually happens to people who may have been vocal about different things, and the group or someone in the group is trying to herd them, so to speak, into the fold and be like, you know what, it's time for you to just be like us. And there will be little subtle statements that will be made to people on a team to try and get them to socially adapt to the team, versus the team being more malleable and allowing people to have those divergent ideas that can actually save the project in the end versus hurting the project overall.
Yep.
And then noise is once again that piece of not knowing what's relevant, seeing the wrong information, kind of like hyper focusing on the wrong information versus being able to kind of take a step back and see that piece in how it relates to everything else, or whether or not it actually relates to everything else. Take it away.
And I'll let you take the last one too.
Decision fatigue. You're just overwhelmed. There's just too much.
Too much data.
Yeah, it's too much. They keep, decision fatigue also feels like that person, if you remember back in your school days, that person who was like the tapper, who would kind of sit there and just be like, hey, 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 hey. It feels like that. It feels like everywhere you turn, you're being asked to make a decision, and it becomes overwhelming. It's a massive energy drain, and it keeps us from feeling like we are either able to ask for all of the information that we need to make the decision without that overload.
So we're gonna wrap it up, but here's the thing. I mentioned it before. When we have these frames of reference, even I did years ago, when we think of the word behavioral or neuro, for example, we have that frame of reference that it's, leadership, it's soft skills, it's communication, it's emotional intelligence, and it is those things too. But the brain is way more complex than just those aspects, and those aspects are just one small sliver of the pie, so to say. And so a lot of what we've been talking about during this presentation is in the decision-making domain. And when we think about decision-making, it's not just emotional, it's also cognitive, it's also subconscious things that are going on in your brain you're not aware of, that we're making you more aware of, so you can start, mitigating some of those things. And so that when we start talking about decision-making, it's often loosely referred to as the decision sciences. And so this last slide is one of my favorites because I tried to kind of put it into perspective in terms of, well, we have a lot of emphasis on data science. We hear that a lot. And why? Because we can see it. It's in the physical world. It's easier for us to manage. And so we do naturally spend a lot of time on that. But the issue is that before data ever is processed in a computer, it comes out of your brain first. So the decision originates in your head, the computer between your ears, so to say, before it ever goes into any kind of database or formulation or anything. And so if we want to change the outcomes, we have to change the origination of the data, which is here, before it ever makes it into the computer to be processed. And so that's where I like this comparison, because we put lots of effort into data science, but not much into decision science. We spend billions on data science, but what percentage of our budget is in decision science, right? We keep our data processors updated. You get your updates all the time, right? They're like, oh, you have to update your iPhone. You have to update your PowerPoint, your Microsoft, your Outlook. But how often do we talk about updating what's going on here cognitively? We design our organizations around data, but we rarely design our organizations around decisions and the decision science that drives those, right? We have QA on data. We don't have very much QA on decision science side. So while data only shows performance, decisions change performance. And so I think that's one of the biggest things about behavioral project management and what we see in the future is that we can start to redesign projects and project management, including our methods, et cetera, around our brains and how we think. And there's lots of sciences to pull from to do this. And we've already started doing that. It's not just in the future, we're already starting to do that by bringing in what we know from the behavioral science side and merging it with project management. And that means not just skills, but also redesigning our softwares around the brain, redesigning our processes, our metrics, et cetera, like the 4 modalities that I brought up earlier. Did you have anything you wanted to say here, Jodi?
I saw a question in the chat, so I think we ought to wrap it up because I think there's some good ones, but there's one specifically. Can you give examples on how to mitigate some of these obstacles? Like specifically on cognitive load and the decision fatigue, really take the time to plan your day and to plan breaks with your day. Also look at in the evenings or how much plugged in time that you are having. So you really want to give yourself like the hour before you go to bed. You truly want to power everything down. Do something that does not require electronics and does not require decision making. You know, a hardcore paper book is still, you know, that old school thing, but sometimes it's better than Ambien at helping you sleep, but it's also helpful to keep your brain and get your brain to power down. I've also noticed people using more puzzles, right? Doing those physical puzzle pieces so that then they're just kind of doing these matching activities. Those help to mitigate them as obstacles because the more you keep your brain fresh, the better off you are. Watching what time of day that you are planning or scheduling different meetings. I literally had a manager for years that none of us wanted to meet with her on the day that she met with her financial advisor. It was a bad plan. It was always a bad plan because there would be some hardcore decisions that she needed to make, and you did not want to be the person to meet with her after that. So we generally tried to communicate around that as a team and be like, so does anybody know? And we would kind of work our schedules around. That was a way that we mitigated that as an obstacle because it would impact our work. Some of the decisions that she would then make would impact our work. So essentially really looking at, you know, psychological safety. How are you building those relationships on the team? And are you actually building them? Are you taking the time to build them? Are you creating that place where people can communicate with each other, they can enjoy each other, they feel safe around each other? And that doesn't always happen in the team meeting. Sometimes you have to take things outside.
Yes.
Those are a few that I wanted to cover real quick that were ways that you could mitigate the obstacles.
So I think Sesmita has been gathering questions for us, correct? But before we get to those real quick, I just wanted to let you know for a limited time, you can become a member of the Institute for Neuro and Behavioral Project Management at behavioralpm.com. And if you sign up It is free right now, and that is lifetime membership. We are not doing payments at this time. Or you can contact us at the email there. And then we have our MPPQ certification, which is Neural Plan. That's at neural-plan.com. And there is a $600 discount on that through February 19th with code Chicagoland 2022 for all you Chicago people. By the way, Jodi and I both graduated from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology with our PhDs in business psychology there. And so we're a little bit, have a soft spot for Chicago. So
I wish I was at the House of Blues right now. That would be fun.
yes.
This has been great. There's been a lot of comments that this is resonating with folks from the days that they have had today, as well as just personal and relationship. That they can apply the content to their relationships. There was one other question that asked for any suggested resources.
From what perspective? If it depends on what you're looking at. So if I was going to say from the cognitive perspective, or just thinking of your brain as kind of like the computer and what kind of errors does it make, I would go read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which is just it's pretty thick, but it's a pretty good book. And by the way, what we're trying to do in the Institute is kind of do what Kahneman and Thaler did for economics, creating behavioral economics through behavioral science. We're trying to do behavioral project management through behavioral science, but that's just kind of a quick on that. But yeah, that's what I would recommend from the cognitive side. Jodi?
For psychological safety, I would probably go with Humble Inquiry by Skeen, Peter, and Edgar. I would also look at Super Better is another one that's really good at helping you with some of those kind of brain hacks when you've got cognitive load going on. They talk about it from the respect of pain and pain management, but there's a lot of that powering down of the brain and the ways that you can actually help optimize your brain. That's another really good book.
I got the Humble Inquiry. What was that other book again?
Super Better.
Okay, Super Better. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And it has an app with it. So you can also kind of use games. Like it talks about how using different matching puzzles, like puzzles with patterns, can be helpful. Some people prefer electronic games. Some people prefer like board games, or like I was talking about earlier, people have moved to the puzzle pieces. I know this is old school, but if you're stuck on like noise specifically is another Kahneman book, but there's some other references for noise. You can also look at things that, what was that Rebel one, Josh? That
yes. It was in my backpack just today.
It happens.
Hold on, I'll get it for you.
Cognitive load working right now.
So cognitive load definitely working right now.
Rebel Talent.
Yes.
Rebel Talent.
By Dr. Francesca Gino.
I recently picked up a book called Selfless Leadership. So for those of you who are into the servant leadership aspect, Selfless Leadership is written by a person who really looks at that servant leadership aspect from the Agile perspective.
Awesome. I posted it for everybody, so they have a list of books.
What other questions? Do we have any other questions out there?
Those were all the questions that were in the chat. Anyone?
Okay.
So I guess we can take one. So if somebody wants to have a question, you could just kind of unmute and ask a question. One last question.
Yes, please. We love questions.
We do, but we also like all of the really positive feedback too.
And there is quite a bit of that, so thank you.
So the hemispheres are still there, but they're not viewed the same. The question in the chat is the construct of brain hemispheres left and right still relevant? It is not as relevant as it once was. You still have the corpus callosum, which does exchange information from one hemisphere to the other. However, as we've learned more about the brain, we're recognizing that it's more of a neural networking system versus a one side versus the other side. And we've also learned that for survivability, there are different kind of like a primary route to a region and a secondary route. So you may have kind of like an overworked area of the brain and an underworked area of the brain that mirror each other. So the brain actually doesn't do things as like spot on regionally located as it once was thought. It does more things in kind of, they're calling them voxels, VOXELs. They're kind of like these micro centers that are happening in different areas, and they happen across networks and neural networks rather than just simply in like the frontal cortex type thing.
I just want to address one quick question. There was one on here about how to handle cognitive dissonance real quick. And Jodi is really good at this one, but I wanted to bring up reframing because reframing is one of the ways. So cognitive dissonance, just generally, and you guys are going to recognize these responses. There's generally several responses to cognitive dissonance. If I bring up something that's uncomfortable, someone's either going to accept that information, reject it, minimize it, or discredit it. And reframing is one of those ways to change it to something that's very uncomfortable to something that may be more comfortable. For example, if we're talking about risk, we were talking about risk earlier. If a risk is uncomfortable, the risk is because something bad may happen. But if we reframe that and say, well, now we get a chance to mitigate it. What steps can we take to mitigate it? We actually get a chance to reduce the discomfort associated with that. So reframing how that risk looks is one way to do that. I mean, there's obviously other ways to do it. And that's one of the things that we address in NeuroPlan, which was a good question anyway, on the dissonance side, is there's actually a process specifically in that circle that we have about reframing before you get to risk, or reframing unidentified risk is what we call it. So I just wanted to address that real quick.
The Humble Inquiry book also has some really good suggestions for how to use. There's also another book called Curiosity by Todd Kashdan. And he talks a lot about how to use curiosity as a way to keep yourself out of some trouble, but also how to use curiosity as a way to diffuse. So you can use curiosity in a reframe, and you can also use humble inquiry in a reframe. And you really kind of pose something as a question, and depending upon your relationship with the person, it can totally change the nature of it. So there's a situation where Josh and I have been involved with different data points, right? And we've had somebody who has a lot of dissonance, and we're at the point of kind of asking the question, okay, so we've had this data